The idea was to sort of polish and to sort of develop an interior life.
And so much of what you talk about has to do with interior life and developing that and the spirituality that leads to self-knowledge and compassion. But you've become such a global traveler and citizen. And I'd just like to have you say some things about how that formation has taken place all these years. It's so different from a kind of sequestered or cloistered life that many of us live, and we aren't necessarily in a religious order that requires it.
Well, I am myself a person that loves and needs solitude and silence. I've never married, and that's unusual for an ex-nun. I mean, nuns usually rush out and they seem to be married almost instantly, but I've never even lived with anybody. And so I am a solitary person, but I once reviewed a book about hermits. And apparently the more solitary a hermit, like St. Anthony, becomes, the more people rush out and drag him out of solitude. And that's happened a bit to me. But let's go back further a bit. I didn't associate religion with compassion. I mean, I know that we had all these texts, love one another as I have loved you, charity, St. Paul, and people were always talking about love. But I found religion very unkind. The way we were trained in the convent in those days, and they were doing it for our good, was to toughen us up. It was a bit like boot camp, you know, where you're to make you a tough person. We weren't to have friends, and we became cold to one another. And that was one of the things that took me out in the end. I thought, this can't be, has nothing to do with the Gospels as far as I could see. And that wasn't because the nuns were bad or wrong. This was the way the religious were trained before the Vatican Council, which started, I think we'd got into a kind of rut, and I had the old system at its worst. And then, you know, when I left the order, you know, often when you heard somebody on TV, say a clergyman or a bishop or something, they were always condemning something. Or speaking, you know, or saying with delight, well, we're not in communion with that. As though this was something to be proud of. And increasingly, I thought, don't want anything to do with this. So you talk about spirituality. I I hopeless at praying, which was a real downer for a nun. I just couldn't do it. I was hopeless at my meditation. I can concentrate on my books without noticing the time passing. But when I was doing my meditation, I'd just start kneeling down and off I'd go. It was the wrong kind of prayer for me. So and God, you know, seemed just totally out of the picture. So I just left the whole thing and wanted nothing to do with religion ever again.
And then went into academic work?
Well, there were a series of career disasters. My plan was to become a professor in English literature.
When you speak of these
birds of the air and the lilies of the field, to work night and day for the coming of the kingdom here on earth, in which rich and poor will sit down together at God's kingdom, in God's kingdom, at the same table. So in the late 17th century, the word belief began first in scientific circles to mean acceptance of doctrine. Acceptance of, and Newton uses it for that in the first way. He says that when I began my researches, it was one of the things I hoped was that it would work with thinking men for belief in a deity, in our sense, that we'd be committed. But these doctrines are calls to action. Just as Jesus was issuing not a set of doctrines on the Sermon on the Mount, he is telling you what to do. Religion is not a notional thing. These doctrines are about action. So, St. Paul starts talking about what would be one day, starting in the 4th century, called the Incarnation. And he says that Jesus was in God's image, but he didn't cling to this high honor, but he emptied himself and became a sort of servant to suffering humanity, even to accepting death on the cross, emptying himself of that ego that clings to self-importance. And because of this, God raised him high. But then St. Paul says, it is not a doctrine lesson. He begins it by saying, you must have the same mind as Christ Jesus. Then he says his nature from the first was divine. And he fills that up by saying, each of you must think of others as better than himself. Each of you must live as one. Each of you must, instead of clinging to your self-importance, think of other people's interests beside your own, the golden rule again. And if you don't do that, you're not going to get the doctrine of Christ. Even the Trinity, I won't go into that now, but even Trinity is about emptying of self. And it means action. You do it in the liturgy and in communion with other people. And it's very clear in Islam, for example. The Quran has no time at all for systematic theology. It calls that kind of compulsory thinking about God zanna, self-indulgent guesswork, about matters that nobody can be certain about one way or the other, but which makes people quarrelsome and stupidly sectarian. Because we're talking Allahu Akbar, God is always greater. Faith in the Quran means giving to the poor, freeing your slaves, looking out for the person in need and in distress. The 5 pillars of Islam about going on pilgrimage, fasting, giving alms. They're not about accepting doctrines. Judaism. First, I remember right at the beginning of my studies, talking to the late rabbi, no, he wasn't a rabbi, late Chaim Maccabee, scholar. And he said to me, he told me the story I told you tonight about Hillel. And these pagans coming to him and saying, we'll convert. And I said, well, that's all very well, I said. But what were these pagans supposed to believe? And Chaim said, it's very easy to see you were brought up Christian. We don't have that kind of thing. It's about doing things. Behaving in a way that changes you, that takes you beyond yourself. It's like learning to swim. You can't learn to swim by reading a book about it. The only way to do it is by getting into the pool and learning to float. You can't drive a car by reading the car manual. You have to get in and manipulate the brakes and everything, and then it'll become second nature. And it's a kind of knowledge that you don't think about when you get into the pool, right, I must. You know it, just as a dancer knows how, but it takes practice. Practice. And I think if you think of what baptism was in the early church, not just dunking a baby, with a few little drops on its head. They thought that religion was really too important for children. This was a serious stuff. And of course, in the early church, it was very dangerous.